So, hello, welcome to this virtual dialogue, Cuba at a Crossroads, Why U.S. Policy Still Matters, brought to you by the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. My name is Ricky Bevington. I'm president of the council, and the council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization dedicated to amplifying informed thought leadership that prompts new thinking on critical global issues. Throughout the year, we feature diplomats, dignitaries, executives, and subject matter experts, and they provide world-class analysis of everything from geopolitics to foreign policy, trade and the economy, emerging technologies, armed conflict, climate change, health and humanitarian issues, and many more. You can learn more about our work and subscribe to our newsletter for upcoming events at our website, wacatlanta.org. Our featured speaker for today's conversation about Cuba is Amanda Mattingly, and interviewing Amanda today will be Ambassador Charles Shapiro, former U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela and President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council. And this conversation is part of a dialogue series that Charles has been leading this year called Beyond Borders, focusing on the United States' ongoing foreign policy redirects under the new administration. So here's some background to set us up for today's questions. On June 30th, the White House issued a national security presidential memorandum to strengthen the policy of the United States toward Cuba. It reinstates strict limits on U.S. tourism and financial transactions that benefit the Cuban government while promoting support for civil society, internet access, and private enterprise. This is according to the memo. But this does come at a critical juncture for the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban government remains entrenched in outdated and inefficient economic models that continue to stifle growth and innovation. And the nation faces a looming leadership transition with Fidel Castro deceased and Raul Castro now 94 years old. And most concerning for watchers is long-term stability, accelerating the exodus of young, educated Cubans, particularly university graduates, who are leaving in record numbers, also called a brain drain. So what are the consequences of the Trump administration's approach, and how are other countries responding to Cuba's economic crisis? What does this all mean for the U.S. influence in the region? Here to lead this conversation, welcome Ambassador Charles Shapiro. Charles will lead a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes and then turn to audience Q&A. Use the question function. Charles will give you instructions once he joins. For housekeeping, this program is on the record. The statements made today are those of the speaker, not of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Shapiro to introduce our speaker. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks, Ricky. I appreciate it. And thanks to the audience for joining us and spending your lunchtime with us. I think that's really cool. I've got the sense that Cuba, despite the executive order you just mentioned, Ricky, has essentially disappeared in the news. Biden administration kept its head down on Cuba, and the Trump administration seems, if I understand it correctly, to have changed little. And that's why we've invited Amanda Mattingly to be our expert panelist today. Amanda is a former U.S. diplomat, the founder of ACM Global, an international political risk and business consulting firm with clients operating or investing overseas. Amanda studied, traveled, worked on projects throughout Latin America, including Cuba. She and I have worked together and have been friends for more than 25 years. We worked together in Washington, in Caracas, and in Atlanta. Now, a bit of full disclosure. Amanda and I are the co-founders of Art of Diplomacy Tours and have been organizing trips to Havana since June of 2023. I will do my best to avoid having this conversation sound like an infomercial. These are the questions Amanda and I talk about among ourselves all the time. And that's why I'm counting on the audience, on y'all, to ask tough questions. If you haven't used the question function on Zoom before, as opposed to chat, put your cursor down at the bottom of the picture. One of the things that shows up is questions, and click on that and please use the question function. So Amanda, let me start. You've been traveling to Cuba repeatedly over the past few years, but your first trip was back in 1997, if I understand correctly. How has Cuba changed since then? And your most recent trip, was it last month in June.
Yep.
How has it changed in the past 6 months since you and I were there together in January of 2025?
Great. Yes. Thank you, Charles. I appreciate it. Thank you, Ricky. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's so exciting when people want to talk about Cuba. And Charles and I, we could, really go on and on for a long time about it. So I'll try to keep my answers brief. But yes, my first trip to Cuba was in 1997, what they euphemistically called the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union. I was a graduate student at Georgetown. I had been traveling on a grant, and it was a fascinating time. It was really interesting. Cuba was in transition, having lost its benefactor of the Soviet Union. It was trying to find its footing. It was very strapped economically at that moment. But now fast forward, and I guess I had gone back in 2000. I went back in 2015, actually, Charles, with you and the World Affairs Council trip, which I spoke about actually. So that was 10 years ago. And then now we've been going repeatedly since 2023. And it's interesting, Cuba, in many ways, people talk about as being stuck in time. That's something that you hear people say a lot about Cuba, because yes, you see classic 1950s cars, things, buildings that are sort of uh, haven't been renovated and they're sort of stuck in time. But yet there's a lot that has changed. And I would say economically, over the last many years, it has gotten worse economically. And you can actually really even see it in the time that we've been going. So over the last few years with our Art of Diplomacy trips. So that's been hard to see. I would say in the past 6 months, more recently, so we were there in January, right at the time of the change of US administrations. And so there were a lot of questions and concerns about what was going to happen to U.S. Cuba policy. And then when I was there in June, just last month, I would say that things economically are very much the same, which is to say, not good. They are experiencing shortages of everything: food, medicine, gas. So you see lines of taxis at gas stations, and you hear about stories of rolling blackouts in Havana and then elsewhere around the country. So, and then just something very like palpable in the streets. There's just more just trash. Why is that? Well, you need gas to run the garbage trucks. So it's things like that that are noticeable. Every time we go, there feels like it's even more and more critical. But like with Cuba, what's interesting is you can say that every time I've gone, I've thought, wow, can Cuba get quote unquote worse economically? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, let me ask you a basic question. I was bumped into a friend last night who asked, "Is it legal for Americans to go to Cuba?" So is it? Can you go?
Yes, it's a great question. Yes, Americans can go to Cuba legally if you go under a license that is through the U.S. Department of Treasury, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. They allow for certain categories of travel legally for U.S. citizens to Cuba. And so our trips that we craft are within a provision of that regulation. So it's a license that's educational travel, support for the Cuban people to people exchanges is what it's colloquially called. And so our trips that we've crafted are all within US regulations. So they are legal. Now, if you're an American who gets on a flight and goes to the beach, that is not legal. That is against US regulations. And just to be clear, I don't know, Charles, if you've gotten this question, but I have, particularly in the spring as we were discussing and talking about a trip in June, I had a lot of people ask, well, I thought Cuba's now on the travel ban list as a like second tier country, so we can't go. I said, no, that is Cuban travel to the United States. So there's actually been very little change in terms of US American citizen travel to Cuba.
Okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, I get this all the time where people say, by going to Cuba, you're keeping a dictatorial regime in power. That the money you spend in Cuba is going to the government of Cuba, that it feeds money to the Cuban Communist Party, that the people you meet with, the people who are speaking to groups who travel to Cuba, are all connected to the government of Cuba or the Cuban Communist Party, and that they are benefiting from this directly. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a question I've gotten to, and I think well, first of all, I first will say that the trips that we go on, and as I've been going to Cuba since 1997, I've only stayed with those who are running their own privately owned hotel or boutique hotel. In 1997, I rented a room from a woman who legally had a license to then be in the very nascent at that time private sector. They call them non-state actors in Cuba. Everywhere we eat when we go there are restaurants that are run, owned and operated by Cuban entrepreneurs. So this is like a very small, I mean, it had been a small private sector, but this is part of what's important to us and about our trips is that we're not staying in Cuban government run hotels or eating Cuban government run restaurants and so forth. We're not using Havana Tour, which is the Cuban government tourist agency that's under GAESA, which is the acronym for the Cuban military organization that runs tourism in Cuba. So it is possible. Now, there are definitely very cynical, folks who believe that, well, this is all just that it's not real, that these people who say they're in the private sector are actually working for the Cuban government. We've met with lots of people in Cuba, and we have lots of friends in Cuba, and I think that is not true. At least as far as I know, and in my conversations, yes, they have to pay taxes to the Cuban government. So I guess if that's what people think is propping up a dictatorial government, then that's their opinion. I do believe that our work is to support the Cuban people. I think it's important for people to understand, and this is something I talk a lot about, is that like Cuba looks the way it does economically because of poor, like gross mismanagement of the economy by the Cuban government. And then there's also the sanctions on Cuba by our government. But in that frame, I think that we can support the Cuban people without supporting the Cuban government.
I've had people tell me that, why do you go to Cuba? It's all blackout, starvation, garbage all over the streets. What was it like when you're in June? Is that accurate?
Well, when we go, yes, I have had those comments as well. And when we've gone, yes, there are things that are really hard to see, right? That in terms of sort of the degradation of Havana and like buildings that are collapsing. Yes, it is really difficult. But Cuba is there's so much life to Cuba too, and to Havana, and all of the people that we meet and that we talk with, and the music and the art. And it's just, Cuba is very culturally rich, and all of that part of the trip, I think, is just really beautiful and gorgeous. And then also I believe that it's important to really confront some of the realities of, what does poor economic policy look like? What does it mean to live under, a one-party dictatorship? I think it's important for Americans to reflect on, what does US foreign policy mean to another country? And I would argue that there are few places like Cuba where you can see the impacts so directly. Of course, there are others, but like Cuba, I don't know if there's a country closer than Cuba where you really see the the palpable impact of our U.S. foreign policy. So for me, that's, I think, important to see and to recognize. And I have found on our trips, Charles, over the last couple of years, that this is one of the things that people like want to talk about. They want to understand that. They want to understand, in addition to enjoying the music and to seeing the art, they do want to understand the social, political, economic impacts on the Cuban people. So, and also they want to support the Cuban people in the ways that they can. So, yeah, it's not all like doom and gloom, and we were not experiencing blackouts ourselves. There are rolling blackouts in Havana, but we did not experience those in our trip. So it's complicated, and for me, that's why I love Cuba. It is really complicated. It's interesting place to sort of puzzle out with other people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a head scratcher. You describe the trips to Cuba, your trips to Cuba, as policy trips. What does that mean? I mean, is that do you have to be a policy wonk to go? I mean, how is that different from the trip I'd go on organized by, Rhodes Scholar takes trips to Cuba, or my synagogue? I just saw one, going to Cuba. I mean, how is what you're doing different from that?
I think, okay, so we call them policy trips because we do talk a lot about political, economic policy. We talk about while we're there and with the people we meet with. So, for example, on all of our trips, we've met with someone from the foreign ministry. So it's called MINREX in Cuba. And so we have a chance to ask them about their foreign policy toward the United States, for example, and to understand their economic policies, ask them about their, politics. And then we've also, while we're there, we've had the great fortune also to meet with U.S. diplomats, current U.S. diplomats who are in Havana. So we get to understand sort of U.S. foreign policy toward Cuba.
Do we have an ambassador there?
We don't at this moment. No, we have a charge d'affaires. His name's Mike Hammer, who is who you worked with for a long time, and we've known for a while. But we don't have ambassadors at this moment. But he's the chief of mission, and we met with him when our group met with him in June when we were there. So that's why we call them policy trips. And also in Cuba, like everything you do in some form or fashion, whether you're talking about like art or identity or we do talk about the economic realities and the political realities on the ground in Cuba. So policy implications are just everywhere. It's infused in everything from trying to understand how the restaurateur procured the food, or, the entrepreneur, how he's going to plan to export his dried mango, to, understanding why there's a gas line. Like there's all sorts of just everyday sort of quotidian things in Cuba that are directly related to policy decisions, right? Whether they're Cuban government policy decisions or US government policy decisions. So that's why we call it like a policy trip, but you don't have to be a policy wonk or like a political junkie, if you will. People who have gone on our trips have been, interested, Cuba curious, have been photographers and artists, or they've been urban planners, or they've been folks who are really interested in global health. So we've had lots of different people who've gone on our trips and have gotten a lot out of it, even if they're not so steeped in policy like you and I are.
How speaking of policy, so how has U.S. policy changed in the past 6 months under the Trump administration?
Yeah, great question. I would say not much. Not much. There was a great shift in US policy from the Obama administration to the first Trump administration. The first Trump administration tightened US sanctions on Cuba and took a harder line. The Obama administration had tried to reset relations and what has been called like a rapprochement with Cuba that started in 2014. And then there was a loosening of some of the restrictions of US sanctions. Like, for example, cruises started going into Havana in that time of like 2015, 2016. And then when the Trump administration came in, they wanted to tighten sanctions again. And so like no more cruises as an example, but you could still go to Cuba under these licensed, Americans could still go to Cuba under these licensed, travel restrictions. And then when the Biden administration came in, they didn't do much to shift the policy at all. And then now, since the Trump administration has come in, they really haven't done much either.
So Ricky referred to executive order that the administration just issued. What was that?
Yes, I would say that, yes, there was just this new memo that came out of the White House. And I would say rhetorically, it sounds like they have strengthened or tightened the US embargo, US sanctions on Cuba. But in reality, not much has shifted. There are more hurdles for doing business with Cuba because Cuba is on the state sponsor of terrorism list. But it was on that list throughout the Biden administration. It was only taken off for like 2 weeks, actually, in January. So those are the kinds of things that make it difficult to do for like Cuba to access financing, for example, or to access hard currency, things like that. But so that has not shifted. My understanding of the new sort of tightening of the policy is that they'll try to audit travel or different trade, that they'll probably try to enforce some of what's in the US sanctions, which is codified into US law, by the way, under what was called the Helms-Burton Act, try to enforce some of those third-party sanctions. So that's to say, try to go after, like a Europeans for doing business in Cuba, or like maybe they're going to, like there was a big deal about Europeans who couldn't get, if they'd gone to Cuba, they would lose their ESTA visa to the US. So things like that make it more complicated for third parties to do business with Cuba. But as far as I understand, trips like ours, Charles, that we've designed that are within US regulations, existing regulations, can continue.
I understand that specific hotels by name are on a list produced by Treasury Department, and that Americans are not allowed to stay in those. They're allowed by Cuba, but they're not allowed by our government to stay in those hotels. Why is that?
Yeah, yes. So it's called a restricted list of entities. These are Cuban government run entities. So like, for example, there's this brand new, it's called Torre K23, which is in Havana. It's this brand new hotel that is Cuban government run and a joint venture with Iberostar, which is a Spanish entity. And so that's run through that Cuban military entity that's called GAESA, or that's colloquially what it's called. It's an acronym. And those entities provide money directly to the Cuban military within the Cuban government. So those are restricted for access.
So the profits from those hotels go to fund the Cuban Ministry of Defense.
Exactly.
Okay, and that's why they're off limits.
Yes, and that's why they're off limits to for legal American travel. Yes. But to be clear, people go to those who are, Canadians or Latin Americans or Europeans who are going to Cuba.
I saw an article today that said that tourism to Cuba is down significantly, and that the occupancy rate at these hotels has just really dropped off. Why is if Canadians, Europeans, Latin Americans, there's no restrictions on them going to Cuba? Why is tourism from other than the United States off?
Yeah, I saw that too. And also they had revised figures for, I guess, for GDP and said, and just last week, I think it was, and official statistics, take that for what you will, that's Cuban government. But that the economy had contracted by 1.1% last year as a result of the fall off in tourism. And you can see that when you're on the ground, that there are fewer tourists for sure, fewer people. And just anecdotally talking to people, there are fewer Europeans, fewer Latin Americans, and definitely a lot fewer Americans who are traveling to Cuba. And the reason, I mean, I think is there is some misperceptions about what for Americans of like how to go legally. So that's one. And then I think also, just the economic situation in Cuba is such that, when people hear about rolling blackouts or scarcity, you know, it gives them pause. And the sad part for me, Charles, is like, it really is the Cuban people who are suffering as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true everywhere there are economic sanctions. The governments have a much better ability to endure economic sanctions than ordinary citizens do.
Yes.
And you see that around the world. We got tons of questions from the audience, so we're going to start questions in a minute. But let me ask you one last question before we go to the audience.
Sure.
It seems to me that Trump administration policy in some ways is ambiguous, I guess is a nice way to put it. On the one hand, as in this executive order that was just released, they talk about increasing pressure on the government of Cuba. On the other hand, the U.S. government wants the government of Cuba to accept Cuban citizens deported from the United States. And in fact, the Trump administration is deporting Cubans in the United States. Has that ever happened before? I mean, that you can remember? And obviously the government of Cuba has to agree to accept people being deported, right? So are those two policies contradictory? I mean, how do you square that?
It's a good question. I mean, you know what? I think they are contradictory. Like if you're going to put pressure on the Cuban government to have a democratic transition, or this idea that, like, supposedly Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who I'm sure you all know is Cuban American, I think he's for a very long time had the idea that if you squeeze something hard enough, it will break, right? So if we tighten the sanctions enough, that the regime will fall and Cuba will transition to democracy and will uphold human rights and so forth. And but then, so that's on the one hand, but then on the other hand, we're asking them to take their people back. So you're asking them so we're sending their people back to a dictatorial regime. Is like, it is a contradiction for sure. Also, it contradicts what has been longstanding immigration policy in the United States, whereby Cubans had preferential treatment, where if you arrived in the United States as a Cuban and you claim asylum, you get it. This is a huge change for Cubans. I read there are as many as 500,000. Charles, I don't know if you have that same number, but of Cubans who are in the United States right now with irregular status because humanitarian parole, which was a program under the Biden administration, has now been revoked. So those are the people who are not here. They're in their immigration proceedings, but are not here on a green card or not here on a visa. And so they're the ones who are being deported. And as I understand it, the 7th flight of deportations is scheduled for tomorrow. So it's happening, yes. And I think it's come as a very big, my understanding from Cuban Americans, my friends in Miami, it's come as a very big surprise to a lot of the Cuban American community in Florida, particularly, but also those I know who are in New Jersey and New York, that had supported President Trump and had voted for him, but didn't see this as coming. I know that there is a lot of focus in the White House on migration and of returning Cuban migrants. So it seems right now that part of the administration is they're having more influence over policy than, let's say, the more traditionalists like the Marco Rubios who want to see democratic change. That would be my answer.
It's a complicated answer because the situation is complicated,
It
right?
is very complicated.
Okay, I'm going to, these are questions from the audience,
Great.
and I appreciate them all. Some people have submitted multiple questions, and I'm only going to ask one from each person until we get through all of them, and I'm not necessarily going to do these in order. First question is from Kasra Kazemi, who says, thanks for organizing this. My high school teacher is Cuban, and she tells very sad stories of people not having access to food while tourists can, both in hotels and in markets and in private homes that cater to tourists. It's like there's a divide between foreign tourists and nationals, where tourists are treated well, and there are even separate hospitals for foreign tourists, while local Cubans suffer. Is number one, is that true? Number two is, how does that improve?
Yes, it is true. And it's one of the complicated realities of Cuba is that Cuba's economic crisis has created a bifurcated society. You have people who have access to dollars and you have people who don't. It also tends to fall on racial lines as well. So
how is that?
I would say more white Cubans who have family abroad receive remittances from family members. I think you will see more. I mean, not this. This is very generalized, but you'll see more white Cubans in Havana in the tourism industry. So they have access to dollars, right? So it then creates, again, what the Cuban Revolution was supposed to eliminate, which is disparity of wealth and income. And you see it in Cuba. And then you see it, yes, as a foreign national in Cuba, as an American traveler, for them, we are tourists, even, our government sees us as, doesn't see us as tourists, but you, yes, do stay. You have food at your hotel. You do have electricity in your hotel. Yes, that is all true. There's gas in the car for us to go around places. That is very hard for people. That has been something that we talk about on our trips. It is very hard for people to know that we might meet with someone who doesn't have eggs at home for breakfast, but we just had eggs this morning at our boutique hotel. So it is very difficult. My answer is that by going, our dollars, our US dollars that go to our speakers and to the folks who are running the hotels and the people, the musicians and the artists, like that is helping them. And so for me, that is how I can live with that. And I think it's more impactful that people go, and that I understand that when I tip somebody and when I'm in Cuba and I give them $20, well, that's more than like maybe their mother who works in the state sector earns in a month. So I know that money is going to support a lot of family members. It's the same thing when Cuban Americans send remittances to their family. It's doesn't just go to one person. It goes to like the whole raft of relatives and tios and tias and, family members who are there in Cuba. So, but it is one of the sad realities of really poor economic, political policies in Cuba and our own US foreign policy.
Ann Stewart, who went with us on a trip to Cuba, asks, what has happened to the private entrepreneurs that we met? Are they still in business, or has the government increased, decreased restrictions on them? What can we do to help them survive as independent business people?
Yes, many of them are. Some have left. We have, like, for example, we've met with like fashion designers, Cuban fashion designers who are in the private sector, and some have left the country. And that's something that Ricky mentioned at the very beginning of this program, is that there are people who younger Cubans, when they have an opportunity to leave, they have been. I mean, over 1 million people have left Cuba since 2021, since COVID. And so it is a reality that those who have access to dollars, and those who have access maybe get a visa to Spain, or they do leave. People leave. But those on the ground that we meet with in the private sector, that Anne has met with, and that we have in trips since, they're still trying to make it, right? Even, no matter what the Cuban government throws at them or what our government throws at them, they're very resilient people, super resourceful. And, tell us all about the amazing, fascinating ways that they are able to make business work in a country that you can't even take a business class in. There is no business school in Cuba. So these are Cubans who are like figuring it out on the fly. Like we've met with one guy who runs like a software company, and he's just trying to figure it out. Another guy who is exporting dried mango. I think I mentioned that earlier. And they're just trying to figure it out, and within the existing regulations, and things change all the time. For example, one new hurdle was the Cuban government has put in new regulations around cell phone, like the amount of minutes you can get, right? And so that impacts a lot of these private entrepreneurs who are getting the word out through Instagram or, on social media. And so if they don't have access, to more minutes on their cell phones, that impacts their business. So, they do the best they can, for sure. And it's, and some of the things that we hear about in terms of like pure, like restaurant owners trying to, get supplies, it's just things that we would never even imagine here in the United States.
So are the people who are restaurant owners,
Yeah.
the people who have these small businesses, some of which, like this software guy, is not so small anymore, the people who run private restaurants, and are they members of the Communist Party of Cuba? Are they the relatives of people who are government members? I mean, how do they have the privilege to do that in Cuba?
Okay, so I would say everybody in Cuba, yes, is somehow has to be connected to the Cuban government, because it is a state. I mean, the Cuban Communist Party is the only entity. It's the only political party, right? So so that is all true. I would say that that not everybody now has to be a part of the Communist Party, however. So so there are many people, like a restaurant owner who we've met, like they're not part of the Communist Party, but they still need to pay taxes to the government, right? They still have to they have to abide by the government regulations, of course. There is not the same kind of fear there was in, like, from, let's say, like the 1990s. But there is, like, where there was fear of retribution, or there was fear that like a neighborhood watch was going to report you for being counter-revolutionary. Like, that doesn't exist in the same ways today that it did then, that I witnessed. But there are people who they're just, they're fed up, and they don't buy into the model, but they are associated. In theory, Charles, you apply for a license to be in the private sector, right? In reality, I am sure that there is corruption involved to a certain level, and that those who are connected to the military or to the Cuban government may have greater access to goods and services. Yes, I think that is true. And then also on another level, which I just mentioned, is those who have access to the Cuban, have access to dollars from their Cuban American relatives, or, you know, a Cuban American family has helped to reinvest in the home that then becomes the boutique hotel where we stay. You know, that's another level of like who has the ability to sort of advance and who doesn't in Cuban society today.
Okay, we're going into the period with quick questions and hopefully quick answers. So
All right,
'cause
yeah.
I want to go through as many of these as I can. Rachel Adonis asks, are the Cubans with whom you meet able to have candid conversations? Do they censor themselves?
Yes, they're candid. Yes, today. And that actually is a really big difference from like 1997 when I was first there to today. It is, yes, people feel candid to speak out. There have been, I mean, there were protests in Cuba in July of 2021 and that were handled swiftly by the Cuban government. So there is a reluctance by, you know, for people to assemble for fear of retribution. I mean, there are political dissidents in Cuba. Yes, there is political repression in Cuba. Yes, so that does exist. But when you're speaking to Cubans and you're on the ground there in Havana, I have not experienced anyone who censored themselves or felt like they couldn't be critical of the government in the ways that they were in the past.
Okay. Odette Schuler, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, asks, do you engage with political dissidents when you're there? Is that possible to talk to people who are actively opposed to the government of Cuba?
There are individuals who are sort of on, I guess I would say like on our US government list of dissidents, and we are not, the purpose of our trips are not to meet with them specifically. So I would say no to that. However, we speak to all sorts of people in Cuba, like that we can, and you know, of all like, you know, entrepreneurs and doctors and academics and the average, you know, person working at the bodega, a wide range of people. Yes.
Keith Valentine asks, are U.S. cruise ships allowed in Cuba? Does U.S. allow cruise ships to go to Cuba?
Good question, Keith. They not anymore. No, there was a short period of time during the Obama administration in like 2015, 2016, when cruise ships could go to Havana, but that they cannot any longer.
Talbe Ponce asks, have you heard of potential policy changes towards Cuba in the Trump administration powered by Trump interest in potential commercial opportunities in Cuba?
No, no. No, I have not heard of anything that would be, I mean, I think the main focus really is on migration. And then the secondary focus has been on promoting democracy and human rights, and not so much interest from this Trump administration of like commercial ties. No.
Michael Butler asks, at one time, Cuba exported doctors and security people and spies and basketball coaches to Venezuela in exchange for oil and gas. Is that still true?
Uh, yes, they did at that time. At the end of the 90s and the early and the 2000s, that was when Cuba, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba was basically casting about for who's going to be the next benefactor, and that became Venezuela. And in exchange for the oil and gas, they sent, yes, they sent doctors and security. A lot of the security apparatus in Venezuela is Cuban. But that is no longer the situation, given the economic realities in Venezuela, for one. And then, so that has shifted. Cuba can no longer see Venezuela as its like benefactor, if you will.
But it's still getting
They
oil from
do
Venezuela.
still, they do still send Cuban doctors, but not just to Venezuela. They send Cuban doctors as one of their quote unquote exports to lots of places in Latin America. And also, yes, like security personnel.
Venezuela used to support Cuba. Is that still the case? Asked Christian Evans.
I mean, politically, yes, they're still supportive. Nicolas Maduro, who is the president of Venezuela, is still, yes, supportive of Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's the current president of Cuba. Yes, politically. Economically, they are, as I said, their situations has changed due to U.S. sanctions on Venezuela and just a gross mismanagement of that economy by the Venezuelan government means that there's less oil. And so they are not providing the same amount to Cuba that they did. That kind of bridged that period, got them through into the 2000s. Yeah, so that's no longer, that arrangement is no longer the case.
Ann Rosenthal asks, what are the likely dynamics within Cuba when Raul Castro dies? I mean, he's 94, presumably he's not immortal. What happens?
Yes. Yes. Great question. That is the question, actually, I think, for a lot of Cubans and a lot of people who are in policy in the US. It is, he still is very much, I mean, anecdotally, and what I understand, he's still very much like, quote unquote, in charge, even though the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has been in office since 2019. And supposedly is going to be his second 5-year term is up in 2029, and there'll be another transition. But Raul Castro has been like very much at the helm for sure. When he dies, it is not clear to me that the current president or any other has the same sort of like revolutionary fervor that the old guard did. So I think you'll see a great amount of change in Cuba at that time. And it might not all be peaceful. It could be, I mean, it could be very chaotic when that change happens. And I think that that's something that the Cubans worry about. I think it's something that US government, from a national security perspective, certainly also worries about.
But Cuba has a president who is not Raul Castro. I mean,
right.
Yeah, and nobody even mentions his name. I mean,
well, I just did. It's Miguel Miguel Diaz-Canel. Yes, very few people do. I'm sure most Americans wouldn't know that the Castros are not in charge in Cuba. But they are still, like,
yeah, not
the
formally,
regime
but
is
yes.
still the regime. It's like he was the hand-picked puppet, right? Successor. So it's not until Raul passes that I think we'll have a shift. I mean, if it's another family member, then by the way, the Cubans believe that we keep moving the goalposts. They told us that in June. Well, we think that you keep moving the goalposts, and that's why you don't change policy. But we have a new leader, and you still didn't change policy, so we don't believe that you ever will. That was the Cuban government line.
Jill Thornton asks, how the Cubans who are being deported from the United States to Cuba, how are they treated in Cuba?
Yeah, Jill, great question. My understanding is that when they are received and repatriated back to Cuba, it's like with very little fanfare. It's like they're not trying to make a big deal about it. And as I understand, there is support to reintegrate people with, into the fabric of Cuban life. But, they've lost everything that they had. And so they're then depending on, family members and friends to sort of reintegrate. As far as I know, I haven't heard about instances of like political retribution for those who've been repatriated. But Charles, you may know different. I just haven't heard of that right now. There's it's such an interesting and actually tight relationship between Cuba and Cuban American population, and so even though we are like Cuba's enemy, the United States government, like, there's an incredibly close familial ties between Cubans and Americans via the Cuban American community. So I think there is some effort. My guess is that there's some effort to really help those who have been repatriated. I've heard of, I've heard of like mothers who have gone to their normal check-ins with ICE what they thought were their normal check-ins with ICE as they're going through their asylum proceedings, and that they've been deported. And I know that's gotten some press, and so people on both sides of the Florida Straits are trying to, do what they can to help those folks. That's my understanding. I could be
Okay.
wrong on that though.
Loads of questions. Here's and this is not a question but a statement. I don't think you need to respond to this. I'm a
Okay.
Cuban. I came to the United States 4 years ago. One clarification: it was never the case that people had to be members of the Communist Party. It is certainly not true today. I lived there, and very few of the entrepreneurs I knew were relatives of the nomenclatura or connected to the government or the Communist Party in any preferential way. So we'll just let that stand for itself.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
Gustavo Arnavat, an old friend, asks, the term regime change wasn't contained in the president's June 30th memo. Was this inadvertent, an omission, deliberate signal? What's going on?
My guess is that they're much more focused on transactional, like we want to return migrants. And so they're not as focused on democracy. But that's true of the Trump administration just in general. Their overall foreign policy is less. I mean, they just issued a memo to all State Department employees that we're not talking about democracy or commenting on that in the same ways that we have in the past. So regime change, I don't think is at the top of the White House's list, though it surprises me in many ways because I'm sure Marco Rubio would love to see that happen on his watch.
Stephen Kay, who went to Cuba with the World Affairs Council in 2015, asks the following, and he says, you've been meeting with a lot of the same people for over 10 years now. What changes do you see with respect to their mood, or in the case of government officials, the party line? Are you hearing things that surprise you?
The biggest change I would say is from some of the folks, to be clear, some people we haven't been seeing for the last 10 years because they've left Cuba. So that's one, Steve. The other I would say though is the biggest change from the time that we went in 2015 to now is in 2015, there was this great sense of optimism that that they were on the cusp of change, that there was going to be new like economic reforms, that there might even be a political opening, and that the United States had a different stance. And they literally in Cuba call it the Obama boom. And they believe that things were going to change. It was going to be maybe not like immediate, but that we're moving in that direction towards change for better economic and political liberties for the Cuban people. And I would say now that sentiment no longer exists. People are just, I would say, very resigned and just trying to get by, standing in lines for bread, trying to figure out with their brother how we're going to get gas, like very pragmatic economic realities.
Okay, Steve Leeds asks, what is life like outside of Havana? There were a whole bunch of resorts that were built outside of Havana, along the beaches in 2000, that were visited predominantly by Canadians and Europeans. Is that still the case?
There's a beach town called Veradero that I have not been to in a long time, but I understand that those hotels still exist and are still operational, and Canadians can fly right there and right out without even going into Havana or going anywhere else in the country. So that does happen. That still is in play. But I would say that outside of Havana, like if you're experiencing rolling blackouts in Havana, which they are, you are definitely experiencing those shortages in the provinces. So like as you go farther out, definitely.
Okay, I've got more questions that we don't have time to ask, and I want to thank everybody for submitting these. I think they've been great. Amanda, I've got a final question. I've asked every speaker. I forgot the last one, but I've asked every other speaker, and that is, where's your favorite bar or restaurant around the world?
Okay. That's right. You have been asking this question. Okay. So I'm tempted to say something here in Atlanta where we are. But you know what? I'm going to say actually, I'm going to give a plug for Cuba. My favorite restaurant in Cuba is La Barrida, which is a place that we've taken all of our groups in the last couple of years. And it's in this beautiful old building, and the folks who run it are lovely. And it was featured in the movie Fresa y Chocolate, which came out in the 90s. It's called Strawberries and Chocolate. And it's a really neat place. It's like, it's a real Cuban gem. And I do love going there. So I highly suggest people come on our trip and go there with us.
Okay.
And our next one is planned for January, in
Great.
case anyone's interested.
Very cool. Amanda, thanks so much for spending an hour with us. I think it's been terrific. I've got Ricky's face has miraculously reappeared. So let me thank you, Amanda. Ricky, thank you for letting us do this. And I want to thank some World Affairs Councils who have promoted this to their members and around the country. Be sure and join your local World Affairs Council. We're going to post this on the World Affairs Council of Atlanta's YouTube channel this afternoon, the recording, and we'll send everybody a link. Please share it with your friends. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. If we get enough subscribers, apparently some tiny amount of money will accrue to the World Affairs Council. Right now, that amount is zero. So anyhow, please subscribe. And finally, I want to thank the producer of today's program, Dan Agboga. When I say we're going to post it on the YouTube channel, what that really means is Dan's going to post it on the YouTube channel, not Ricky, not me. So Dan, thank you very much. Ricky, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Charles Shapiro, and thank you, Amanda Mattingly, for today's conversation entitled Cuba at a Crossroads, Why U.S. Policy Still Matters, brought to you by the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. As Charles mentioned, you will be able to find the video of today's dialogue posted on our YouTube channel. Just search World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Please also go ahead and hit thumbs up and subscribe. Please also mark your calendars for Sunday, August 24th. We are doing a virtual program on Sunday, but schedules are crazy. That's when we can do this, but I know you're going to want to tune in. We'll be hosting a free public webinar entitled Greenland and the Geopolitics of the Arctic, featuring the head of mission of Greenland's representation in Denmark, along with 2 other climate and other policy experts. It should be a very good conversation about Greenland and the Arctic. This is scheduled for noon Eastern on Sunday, August 24th. You can register right now at our website, wacatlanta.org. Also at our website, you can subscribe to our newsletter. So thanks to Charles and Amanda. Thanks to our audience for wonderful questions. I know we could have kept going for another 20 minutes. We look forward to seeing all of you at a future program, either in person or online. And in the meantime, have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, Amanda. Bye-bye.